Hello and welcome to Economic Divide. I'm Kaveh. In this edition, we'll take a close look at economic warfare, in which military undertakings are closely coordinated with the process of destabilizing countries' economies while causing hardship for its citizens. Who are the countries at the forefront, and how do they do it? Well, you have to stay tuned for that. Some of the highlights of today's program.
There is a global military agenda. It's the globalization of war.
Economist Michel Chossudovsky, in his book America's Long War Against Humanity, explains how military undertakings are coordinated with the process of economic warfare. Former World Bank staffer Karen Hudis adds,
Now, I was hired into the World Bank by Dr. Ibrahim Shihada, who had been the general counsel of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Now what you have when the IMF says it's going to provide resources to help payment imbalances, they are setting up systems that benefit themselves.
why would certain countries aim to destabilize financial markets and economies of other countries? Now that is the core question we'll be covering. Economic warfare can consist of imposing sanctions on sovereign countries, but also deliberate acts of destabilization of financial and currencies market short of war, with a view to undermining the national economies. First, a history check of some of the institutions that are involved. There is constant coordination between the IMF, World Bank, and NATO. As was seen in Kosovo, the IMF and World Bank had set up a post-war economic plan, including free market reforms, well before NATO's bombing campaign actually started. In the post-World War II era, the International Monetary Fund was set up to assist with the reconstruction of war-ravaged Europe. The fund was to provide economic aid and guide the economic development of economies that were under massive debt and had seen their economic institutions reach the brink of collapse. Through the auspices of the IMF, Europe worked its way towards economic boom and a fast-paced reconstruction of its infrastructure. During the time, much of the colonized world was emerging from the bonds of imperialism, and new independent nation-states were springing up in different parts of the developing world. These new nations, which had to make independent economic and political decisions now that they were liberated, were seen as ideal economies that needed to be steered in the right direction in order to incorporate them into the global economy. The right conditions, funds, and initiatives had to be taken to ensure economic success and integration. Nations that missed the train, it was argued, would find it increasingly difficult to become a part of the global economy and face brutal competition. The World Bank was thus formed, which focused its efforts and funds on the developing world to help it catch up to Europe and the West as a whole by designing their economic systems that could easily integrate and become part of the global economy while experiencing domestic growth. The IMF and World Bank, also known as the Bretton Woods institutions, ensure that economies both in the developed and developing world are steered in one direction on similar economic principles.
The original intention of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund has not been followed. The original intention when these institutions were founded in 1944, and they're called the Bretton Woods institutions, named after the conference site in New Hampshire. It was a ski resort where these institutions were established. They were actually established to alleviate poverty, and they were there because the idea was that all of the countries, and at that time there were 44 of them, but now there are 188 members of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. The idea was that when the world's wealth came out of hiding because it was put in a special trust fund for the benefit of humanity for 50 years, and the purpose of that was so that at the end of that 50-year period, there would be no other claims, and that wealth of the world would go to benefit humanity, and all of the countries that were members of the World Bank and IMF would be there to decide how that wealth was going to be spent. But unfortunately, what happened was the World Bank and International Monetary Fund were hijacked by the bankers, the banking institutions.
Their aid comes with conditions that receiving governments are legally bound to honor. These conditions were termed by the institutions as structural adjustment programs. Structural adjustment programs, drawn up by the IMF World Bank, sought to radically restructure national economies on neoliberal principles of laissez-faire economy or the free market economy.
Now what you have when the IMF says it's going to provide resources to help payment imbalances, they are setting up systems that benefit themselves. But this has not gone without challenge. And what happened is the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are actually, in addition to being at the very center of the world's financial system, they're also knowledge banks. And so in 2004, a political scientist named Jacek Kugler came to the World Bank with a very accurate power transition model, which predicted that the coalitions would form to challenge the dominance of the bankers. And these coalitions are now actually, they have taken back the true role of the World Bank and the IMF. Those coalitions are the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and the Group of 77, which is actually 133 developing countries.
When the Bretton Woods institutions step in, they destabilize the country by breaking down its fiscal coherence. Through its decentralization policies, where power is diverted from the central government to local governments, the IMF World Bank creates small states within sovereign states. Coupled with enforced austerity and the accumulation of funds in one territory over another, this creates a situation ripe for conflict and internal strife.
I was hired into the World Bank by Dr. Ibrahim Shihada.
So who is Karen Hudes? Karen Hudes studied law at Yale Law School. She worked in the legal department of the World Bank from 1986 to 2007. But more importantly, what did she blow the whistle on? In 2007, Karen warned the U.S. Treasury Department and Congress that the U.S. would lose its right to appoint the president of the World Bank if the current American president of the World Bank did not play by the rules. The 66-year-old gentleman's agreement that Europe would appoint the managing director of the IMF and that the U.S. would appoint the World Bank president ended in 2010 as a result. In 1999, Karen reported the corrupt takeover of the second largest bank in the Philippines.
Dr. Ibrahim Shihada, who had been the general counsel of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And I have maintained credibility with the ministers of finance who have appointed me to exercise their function in distributing the world's wealth to the world's people. And so if you look at what's going to be happening with the International Monetary Fund, they are going to return to their original purpose, and the state capture of the banking institutions is going to end. What happened in 1933 was these banks, the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States and the other central bankers that are members of the Bank for International Settlements, issued gold certificates that carried interest in gold, and these gold certificates have been compounding. They are now worth quadrillions, and this is going to offset all of the country debt. And so the International Monetary Fund is not going to be dominated by the bankers anymore.
So there is a war economy, and the U.S. is leading this campaign. And in the words of Michel Chossudovsky, part of U.S.'s imperial conquest in its long war against humanity. The question is, why would the U.S. be at war against humanity?
There is a global military agenda. It's the globalization of war.
Michel Chossudovsky is a Canadian economist and founder of the website globalresearch.ca, titled The Center for Research on Globalization. His book, The Globalization of War, America's Long War Against Humanity, talks about how the U.S. NATO military machine, coupled with covert intelligence operations and economic sanctions, and the thrust of regime change is deployed in all major regions of the world. It states that this long war against humanity is carried out at the height of the most serious economic crisis in modern history. Some of the chapters in the book include the military undertakings to be coordinated with the process of economic warfare, Operation Libya and the Battle of Oil, redrawing the map of Africa, U.S. NATO-sponsored terrorism, the destabilization of sovereign countries, and war and natural gas, the Israeli invasion, and Gaza's offshore gas fields.
The United States, since the end of World War II, has been involved in military actions as well as other types of actions, destabilization, the sponsorship of military coups in all major regions of the world. We start that period more or less at the end of World War II with the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. Then we have the Vietnam War. Then we have also other targets, which is Indonesia, Cambodia. Indonesia, it's a regime change. And all the military interventions in which the United States is participating directly or indirectly are part of that agenda, which is coordinated from U.S. Strategic Command, of course, interfacing with powerful economic groups, and so on and so forth. And in that sense, I describe this as the long, well, in fact, the long war is a military concept. But the United States present the long war as a requirement of self-defense. They make us believe that the United States is threatened. And because the United States is threatened, they have to wage a war against humanity, which is the subtitle of my book, America's Long War Against Humanity.
Time to take a closer look at how the U.S. military undertakings are coordinated with the process of economic warfares. The destabilization of currency markets also affect the U.S. markets, and this is closely witnessed today on how the U.S. has destabilized Europe's financial system.
Economic variables are very powerful instruments of intervention. They have been applied, I would say, since the 1980s with what was called the IMF World Bank Structural Adjustment Program, where you come in with what is described as shock treatment, strong economic medicine. And the main instrument of the IMF in those days applied and directed against third world countries was devaluation of the currency, freeze of wages, and ultimately privatization. Now, those interventions did not necessarily require military action on the part of the United States. The countries are impoverished. The head of state, head of government are replaced. They establish a proxy regime. Wall Street takes over the central bank, and so on and so forth.
In this day and age, there's lots of things that the U.S. government and other governments that are very powerful, steps they will take short of actually dropping bombs or sending in ground troops when they have a conflict with another regime that they consider to be a hostile regime or an unfriendly regime. And so you're exactly right that these will include a whole host of economic penalties or actions, if you will. And there's very familiar things to Americans, that, including sanctions, which are official and out in the open, but there's also plenty of things that many suspect that are being done behind the scenes, acts of destabilization, just as I think most Americans know that the CIA was involved in very covert operations over the decades where teams would go into countries and try to foment revolutions and things like that, or just destabilize a regime that the U.S. government considered to be unfriendly to the U.S. By the same token, I mean, there are firsthand accounts of people coming back saying things like, yeah, I was, it was my job to go in and try to destabilize markets using commercial means.
The collapse of a central government and its institutions allows the entry of Western corporations, which are able to exploit the lack of oversight and dire circumstances to gain access to a country's resources for a fraction of the price and low taxes, all in the name of developing the economy and creating jobs.
The instruments of economic warfare have evolved dramatically. If we look at it historically, 1997 was what was called the Asian crisis. Now, through a process of manipulation of currency markets by institutional speculators, they were able to trigger the collapse of a number of currencies, specifically the Korean won, the Thai baht, and also the Indonesian rupiah. And this was done through what is called short selling. It's an instrument, a speculative instrument, and it is deliberate. The process of triggering a collapse in currency can be undertaken, and it's undertaken by very powerful financial institutions. Now, that same medicine is applied today against countries which are considered inimical, who are considered as enemies of America, particularly the Russian Federation, where you trigger the collapse of the Russian ruble.
One of the important factors in growth is access to affordable energy. And what Russia has done, also because of the way the Ukraine has been destabilized, they have lost their access to the Baltic Sea with what, or that's what the intention was, which is a stability problem and a security problem for Russia. So what Russia has done, and what actually the BRICS have done, is they have decided that they're not going to use dollars in their international trade. That's 25% of international trade. And what Russia is doing in its sale of gas is it's requiring the payments to be made in gold. And if anyone gives them dollars, they convert the dollars into gold. And also, the Group of 77 has also rejected the reserve currency status of the United States dollar. So this means that we have got a huge transition that has got to be accommodated. And it has to be accommodated before the dollar crashes. If we don't take care of this transition, we are going to go into another dark ages. So this is something that needs to be worked on immediately.
U.S.-NATO wars, examples that come to mind. Initially, Libya. For it aimed there was oil, with R2P as a reason to go in. But going to war with the intent of taking over the country's oil, gas, and natural resources, that's being done more frequently. Whether due to R2P or not, but once the war cloud settles, it becomes obvious that the wars were waged with multinational corporations in mind. IMF and NATO missions go hand in hand. Countries which are reluctant to accept IMF World Bank assistance and interference will eventually be subjected to a NATO humanitarian operation, usually under the UN mandate of R2P, responsibility to protect. NATO involvement in countries like Libya and Yugoslavia was carried out under the same principles and had nothing to do with the humanitarian aspect of the situation. There's constant coordination between the IMF World Bank and NATO. If a country refused IMF World Bank intervention, NATO and various covert agencies would step in to create the proper conditions or IMF programs to be imposed. These conditions may eventually include military intervention in one way or another. America's involvement in Central Asia and the Middle East is no exception. The war on terror purports to defend the American homeland and protect the civilized world. It is upheld as a war of religion and a clash of civilization, when in fact the main objective of this war is to secure control and corporate ownership
over the region's extensive oil wealth, while also imposing, under the helm of the IMF and the World Bank, the privatization of state enterprises and the transfer of the country's economic assets into the hands of foreign players.
Another instrument which has now become extremely central to the geopolitical situation is the manipulation of commodity markets, but specifically the manipulation of the energy market. The cost of production of a barrel of oil is very, very low. And in the past, they've pushed that price up to very high levels, leading to very high profit margins as far as the transactions in the oil market. But the fact of the matter is that by triggering a collapse in the oil market, I'm talking about today's context, they actually are betting on a movement, particularly within the derivative market, which then enables them to make massive profits, and at the same time it leads to a slide in the price of oil, which of course directly affects the Russian Federation, which is a major exporter of oil and natural gas. This process has nothing to do, and that's very important, has nothing to do with supply and demand or market forces or cost of production. It has to do with manipulation of the oil and energy markets and concurrently manipulation of the currency markets with a view to making trillion-dollar profits. And I should mention that process doesn't only affect Russia, it affects all major oil and energy producers, including countries like Canada and, of course, Saudi Arabia as well.
The U.S. government has a lot of money at its disposal. If it wants to do something to the Russian currency or to other countries, it certainly behind the scenes could put moves in play and have brokerages acting on its behalf if that's what it wanted to do. Or another example, not that we know whether this happened or not, but a lot of people think that perhaps part of the reason oil fell so much in the past 12 months is perhaps because of the U.S.-Russian conflict, and if U.S. officials thought that, a lower oil price would put pressure on Russia, and so maybe when John Kerry and others were visiting Saudi Arabia, perhaps deals were made behind closed doors. Obviously, we don't know what sort of thing could have happened, but the point is, if Saudi Arabia really did agree to continue pumping oil in an agreement with the U.S. because that would lower world oil prices, clearly they wouldn't just do that to be nice guys about it because they're buddies. The U.S. government would have to be compensating them somehow if the Saudi Arabian officials were producing more oil than made sense for them in terms of profit and loss. And so again, your question is correct that certainly a rich government like the U.S. or other Western NATO countries, they have the power to move markets and do things, just like a billionaire in the private sector would have the ability to do that, but it costs money.
But it is a mistake to say that the movement in oil prices today is the result of market forces. It is the result of both an economic agenda, which is based on making billions and billions of dollars in the oil market through speculative instruments, and on the other hand, it is part of a geopolitical agenda which targets the Russian Federation, and that action is also coordinated with other actions such as economic sanctions, such as military threats, and so on. So there's a multi-pronged approach in global warfare. It is not strictly limited to waging theater wars. You have intelligence operations, and you also have economic sanctions, and then you have the process of speculative attacks against currencies and so on.
That does it for another program. Your thoughts are appreciated as usual. Our links are below. You can also send it the old-fashioned way. Our email address is economicdivide@presstv.ir. I'm Kaveh Taghwahi, and I'll see you next week.